All right, thanks everyone for attending this week's Xojo webinar. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist, and this week I'm going to be covering source control, a very popular topic judging by the number of attendees this week. So first I want to remind everyone that you can go ahead and type in any questions you have while I'm talking at any point. I have a separate screen that shows me your questions and I'll address them at an appropriate time when I can, and hopefully I can answer them. This webinar I'm going to have start a little differently because I got looks like about 4 slides I want to go through before we jump into some actual examples. So I'm going to bring these up here. Nothing fancy for the slides, but since I'm going to be talking, I didn't want to just leave the screen up real boring here. So we're covering source control today, and just briefly for people that aren't familiar with what source control is, it lets you track changes to individual files. It's often used with source code for development, but it really can be used with anything. If you want to use source control with Xojo, you're really best using the Xojo project format, which is the text-based format. And we'll see what that looks like. But essentially, it saves every item, every project item in your Xojo project as a separate text file on disk, which is really how a source control system wants to work. So you can track your changes to the individual files. It's an absolute must when you're working on in teams. You got more than one person on your project. You're going to need source control so that you can track who changed what, and you don't accidentally clobber each other's code. That doesn't mean it's only useful for teams. It's certainly incredibly useful just for a single developer as well. But if you do have a team, you'd be crazy to not be using source control. Another cool feature of using source control is if you do have it hosted somewhere, that the place where it's hosted can actually serve as kind of an additional backup, one of the many backups you should have of your source code, and it's a great way to keep your source code off site, so it's safe, and of course it makes it easier to access and that sort of thing. And there's 2 types of source code systems that I'll be talking about here today. There's the centralized version, which essentially requires a repository in a central location, and you always put all your changes into this central repository. And that is usually categorized by Subversion. There's other systems as well, but we're going to look at Subversion today. And the newer design for source control is something called distributed, and that is most exemplified by something called Git, which we'll also look at today. And there's some similarities, there's differences, advantages and disadvantages to both. I primarily use Subversion myself. I use it every day. Git, I'm still a bit of a newbie. I did talk to a lot of people at our Xojo conference last year who love Git and swear by Git and think it's the best thing since sliced bread. I'm not going to say there's anything wrong with Git. It actually looks pretty good. It's just I haven't had a chance to set up any projects to use it. So I mentioned the Xojo project format, separate files for each project item. It is nice that when you do save your Xojo project, only the items that you've actually changed are saved. So this makes it faster when you're working with large projects. One thing about the Xojo project format, though, is it's only available if you have a Xojo license. So if you're running the unlicensed version of Xojo, the only format you can save in is the binary format, which, although you can use with a source control system, kind of defeats the purpose because you only have a single file and you're not really able to track changes in it. So I talked briefly about Subversion. So Subversion, also like Git, is open source. There's a link right here. You can see there's actually a free Subversion book that covers all the nitty-gritty details of Subversion that you can grab for free. Generally with Subversion, you're probably going to want to have it hosted somewhere. You can pay someone to host it. There's places that offer free hosting. You can install it on your own servers and host it that way. You could even install it, if you were just you could install it on your own machines, in your own office or whatnot. But it does need to be installed somewhere, essentially hosted somewhere. And then there's a variety of client software that you use to connect to Subversion, from the very simple command line, which I won't be showing you because I don't use the command line, to really nice GUI clients like The two that I'll be showing you here today for working with Subversion are the one I primarily use, which is versions, and another one called Cornerstone. And then some common terms you hear when dealing with Subversion is checkout, which is usually the term used to refer to your initial download of the code from the Subversion repository, which is the main repository sitting on the server. Then you have a local or working repository, which is where your changes are made. You then, I left off the word commit on here, but generally after you've made changes in your local repository, you commit them, which sends them back up to the server repository to make them permanent. And then, of course, you can do diffs, as they're called, or check differences between different versions of files. You can merge different versions of files. You can create branches and tags, which in Subversion are largely the same thing. And they're just different, essentially code paths that allow you to have different, completely different code trees and structures to work on that are independent of each other. All right, here we are with Git. And there we go with my PowerPoint. All right, Git. Remind me not to click. As Justin likes to tell me whenever I see him or he gets a chance, Git is it, according to some. Git is also open source, which is great, and also has a book at this URL, which is also great. Someday I need to spend a weekend and actually read that book in its entirety. You don't need to host Git somewhere. You could just run it locally, just like you could with Subversion. But hosting is nice. It gives you some of the benefits I talked about at the beginning. There's a lot of Git places that will host Git and are free, and you can just put your code out there. Probably the most popular one that you may have heard of is something called GitHub, which is free for hosting open source projects, and then you pay to host private projects. But there's many others, and I'll be showing you GitHub and then another one called Bitbucket. Also with Git, you could certainly, you need client software actually to talk to it. And it starts with a command line, just like Subversion. I've never used the Git command line either. We'll take a look here at a couple GUI clients, the GitHub client, and both of which happen to be free, and source tree from the people that do Bitbucket. Git has many similar terms as Subversion, but a few different ones is the term clone, which essentially is the concept of grabbing the code off of the centralized repository and pulling it down to a local area where you can work on it. Commit is the same as Subversion. It essentially is a checkpoint of changes you've made to files. It's not exactly the same because a commit in Git doesn't necessarily take your changes and put them back into the central repository, because Git being distributed does not require that you do that. But those concepts would be the concepts of push or pull or something. I think I'm probably mixing up my terms there. But essentially, it's kind of a two-step process with Git. You can commit it, and then you can send it off to the server. And some of the clients will have a little checkbox that'll say, do this in one step for you. So that's pretty much what we're going to talk about here today. So let's dive right in. All right, here we go. We got Xojo, and I need to have Finder window open. All right, so what we're going to do here is we're going to take a look at the Eddie's Electronics example, which comes with Xojo. And it has a few folders, and it has a desktop and a web version. And by default, it's saved in binary format. So that's not going to work very well. So the first thing we're going to want to do is convert these things to text format. So I'm just going to open them up and then do a save as. And here, because this is a licensed version, I have the different project types. I want to select Xojo project. I'm just going to save it right back in the desktop folder. And then I can close this. So we go back here in the Finder. You can now see, let's make this a little bit wider. I'm going to delete the binary project. I don't really need that anymore. So now we have a new project file just called Xojo project. And you see there's lots of individual files now in the folder. If we go to the user interface one, which is where most of the stuff is, you can see there's individual files for each of the windows, the menu. This is a strings, here's a module. So everything has its own individual file. We'll do the same thing with the web, although we won't actually be looking at that one too much. All right, and the same sort of setup here in the web. I'm just going to get rid of the binary project since we don't need to have that in source control. So I now have my project set up here using the text format the way I want. There's other things that are in these other folders that you may or may not want to put in Subversion. Makes sense to put all the graphics that go with your apps. And of course, the structure and everything is completely up to how you organize your projects. That's not going to matter from Subversion or Git standpoint, but it's just important to make sure you have all the pieces you need gathered together. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is take a look at Subversion. And we're going to take a look at using this place here that offers hosting called CloudForge. I've never actually used them for anything. Just before doing this webinar, I was looking around for a Subversion hosting that I could set up something for free to work with for this demo. And these guys came up here and seem to work reasonably well with Subversion, so we're going to give them a try. And as you can see, they have options that are free and paid, and it's always good to have get your services from people that have ways to earn money so that they don't go out of business and you lose your source control history. So anyway, CloudForge is pretty nice. And here I have set up a account with CloudForge. Now, I can't speak too much about the specifics of CloudForge. I'm only going to use it here for Subversion. Apparently it does have Git support built in, but I wasn't really able to get that working. And not being the Git expert, I'm not entirely sure if that was a CloudForge problem or a Paul problem. It more than likely was a Paul problem. So we'll do Subversion here. So this has this fancy little dashboard here. And I'm going to click to create a project. And we can give it a name, EE Web CloudForge. These names are typically used for folders when you check out. So since we're always doing the same project, I'll have to just make the names look a little unique. Then here I'm going to check that I want to do this using Subversion. And I can pick the repository configuration. And generally, it's nice here that CloudForge has an option for best practice, which is pretty standard when dealing with Subversion. It creates 3 folders for you: trunk, branches, and tags. And there's nothing particularly special about these folders, but it's just a general organizational structure that Subversion uses. And typically, in the trunk folder is where you do your current development. The branches folder is where you might work on an older version, for example, that's not related to the current project. And tags are just ways to tag things. So, for example, one thing that is a great way and commonly used for this is you're working on your project, you release version 1.0. That's great. You go into Subversion and you can tag all the source code at the current point as a 1.0 tag. And then you can keep working on the next version, 1.1, and you're working on it in the trunk, and you'll have a tag. And if it turns out you need to look something up, you can find it in the tag. A lot of people will often also make branches at the same time as well in case they need to do a 1.01 while they're working on 1.1. So it gives you a lot of ability to control your source code in that way. All right, I don't think I need to do anything else here except click Create Project. Did I? Not that you can tell, but I'm trying to click create project. There we go. Seems like it's thinking, I guess. All right, so it created a project. And now in this quick URL section is URL you're going to want to actually check out the project. Depending, this is typically what you're going to use with your Subversion client to pull the project down. And any host you have is going to have some sort of format for this in one way or another. So that's what this is right here. So right now there's nothing here. We've just created an empty project. So the first step with Subversion is to actually check this out so that we get our initial folder structure set up and we can copy our Eddie's Electronics stuff into it. So I'm going to be brave here and I'm going to try Cornerstone first. This is just a trial. I don't generally use Cornerstone, but it looks pretty cool. And I said, hey, why not? This is a perfect time for me to test it out. And it does seem to have some integration with CloudForge. All right, so I can click here and say add a repository. And a repository is, that whatever happens to be hosted somewhere. And this has a variety of ways you can add repositories. It looks like I could pick HTTP server here and just plug in that URL directly, which is probably what you would use if you weren't using something that had a built-in integration here, which apparently is available for something called Beanstalk and CloudForge. So theoretically, actually, what did I call this? Oh, I called the EE Web, and that's not what we wanted. I wanted, let's create a new project. I don't like that name. How's that? We're just going to call it Eddie's Electronics CloudForge, since that is a more accurate name. And as you can see, you can have any number of these things. So that's a good thing to point out. And you typically are going to want to, each of your projects you're going to want to have as a separate project in your source control system. All right, so that's the one I want. So let's go back to Cornerstone. And assuming I remember my login information, this might work. All right, or it won't. So did this a different name? It looks like what I typed. I'm assuming that's the name I needed to type in there, actually. I'm not entirely sure that system name is the project name. Let's try it one more time, but I don't think that is going to be a happy camper. All right, well, we'll go back and do it the way that I usually do it. Oh, no wonder it's not working. I didn't add Subversion to it. I bet that's the reason. All right, so let's just try it again and see if it works with the Subversion repository. Added. Or not. Well, then we'll try it this way. All right, I don't know what this takes 10 minutes to be ready. Never did that in any of my other trials, so let's see if that's true or false. All right, see, versions normally fills this stuff in for me, so we may end up switching to that if I have less luck here with Cornerstone. All right, so our project is not being set up the way we want. Let's just try one more time, creating a new project, checking the right boxes this time. We'll call this one EE test to keep it simpler. All right. I don't see a 10-minute warning here. I did remember to check Subversion. This one's called EE test. So let's try this one. Maybe we'll have better luck. Or not. Well, of course. And like I always say in these webinars, even though I go through these examples 10 times before the webinar day, whenever I'm doing them while recording, something screwy happens. We'll come back to that then. I don't have any idea why that system isn't checking it out at this point. As Justin says, demo gods are mean some days. Yeah, Adrian is suggesting I copy the URL, but yeah, every other time I used Cornerstone, I just filled this stuff in and it just pulled it down. Actually, let's switch to versions and see if that is able to work using the URL. So a similar app. Here we will use the URL. Yes, this is a lot of what I was running into when I was testing CloudForge using Git. I kept getting messages that were very similar to this, but it said it could not open the Git file system. But the Subversion one had always worked. Well, I don't know what is going on with the CloudForge settings. There's nothing special here. So we'll move on to Git. And then maybe if this sits around for a few minutes, it'll maybe it's doing updates in the background or something, and then it'll work later. We should be so lucky, right? All right, so let's take a look at Git. I have two here, so maybe one of these Git sites will actually work for demo purposes. So on GitHub, Xojo has a section, github.com/Xojo, and we've got a couple things there. First thing is something called Text Input Canvas, which is an open source plugin for interacting with keyboard commands. And Eddie's Electronics, which I just uploaded recently. So we can click on this, and you can see what this looks like in GitHub anyway. And you can see the structure is already all in here based on the files. It has the last comment with the last check-in for the particular area. You can actually set up with, and pretty common with Git, is this README markdown file that can have some information in it. And you can see here on the right, there's a URL that would be used to clone it, and then an actual button that I'm pretty sure starts up the GitHub client, which I probably have right here. All right, so if we go to GitHub, this is all logged in already to my GitHub account. And I can click on one of the areas that I have access to, and I can see the two projects that show up right here, same as what we saw on the website. And I can just click the clone to computer button. And it'll prompt me to clone it and tell me where where should I stick it? So I'm just going to clone that as right here in this source folder that I've created here. I'll hit the clone button, and it'll buzz through and pull that stuff down. And if we go back to Finder, we'll see right here now that we've got the folder with the name I gave it, and the files are in here. And I could open up the project. So here's the Eddie's Electronics project, all pretty standard. Let me go back to GitHub, and I'm going to click on that to show the details of that particular project. So you can see there was some various commits that happened here in my initial configuration of it. That's into the history. I can click the changes area, and it would show any changes to the project. There are no changes at this point because we've just cloned it and we haven't done anything. So let's go in and make a change, and I'll just come here and we'll change this to something else. So I've changed just the window title, and I'll save. And we go back to GitHub, and we can see here now that there's some files that are showing up. The first file you see here is the UI state file, which you really don't need to put into any sort of source control because that's individual for each person that's using Xojo. You know, it saves window positions and other things about the UI states. You don't necessarily want that in Subversion, nor do you want that propagating to other developers' computers, as they may not have the same size display or want anything set up the same way you do. So we can get rid of that one. I can click on the window here, and it shows you in the little change viewer what exactly changed. So you can see the changes here in red. This is what the old line was, and in green, what the new line is. And then the little plus and minus are the text indicators for that to indicate what was dropped and what was added. So you can see what the changes. And it's usually pretty handy to do that, to see what changes were made, so that you can type a nice commit summary. So here I could type in now if this was the only change, you know, a client had called me and said, I need the name of that window changed, and it's got a case number in your bug tracking system or whatnot. You can make the change and then commit it. So here I'll type in just something relatively brief, change window title, and I can hit commit. And now that change disappears from the list of changes. Probably shows up here in the history. And it's not going to be showing up, though, if we go back to here. It's not going to show up as the, we'll get to the right folder, because we haven't sent this up, or I guess sent a pull request up to Git, or push the change up to Git. So we can do that again from the client. Come back here, and in this GitHub client, I believe the sync button is what does it. So right here, I guess we probably could have done that at once. Oh, that's a toggle. So this is what I was talking about earlier when I said some Git clients have a way to let you do the commit and sync it up in one step. If you leave that button pressed in, then when you do a commit, it'll actually commit it and then send it off to the server in one step, which is handy if you have a network connection or whatnot. If you don't, and this is one pretty significant advantage of Git, you don't have to do a sync after you do your commits. So it allows you to work offline, but still be committing changes, essentially setting those checkpoints, which is very, very handy. Sometimes you may need to work offline, you may have network trouble or whatnot, and then if you're using something like Subversion, you really can't do any sort of commits back to the server because you don't have a network connection. So let's try this sync branch button. And well, I did the thing out of order, so I'm not sure if it sent it up or not. Oh wait, here we go. Right down here at the bottom. Unsynced commits. I committed these, but I haven't synced them. So this is where the sync button is. I need to be pressed. And it tells me here which ones there are. So there could be multiple ones listed here if I'd synced a bunch. All right. As you can tell, my newness with Git. And of course, that did work when I tried that the other day. So is this going to refresh here or not? I don't see the comment. So I'm going to try and do it here in one step. All right, the one step one didn't give me an error. That's always good. All right, so now I can see on the server, the window has the comment we entered, it has the time, and it was just updated just now. So that did successfully push our change out to the server. And there's lots of other things that this GitHub system can track. Who's doing all the check-ins? I haven't looked at all of this stuff, but how often they're happening, and all things that can be useful when you do have multiple people working on the project, so you can see who's doing what. So anyone right now would be able to go to GitHub, fire up their Git client, and clone Eddie's electronics right down onto their machine, and then work with it. And then my understanding of Git, and I'm a little fuzzy on some of this, is that I'm the owner of this project right now. So my commit went in and took effect in the structure immediately. But if anyone else happened to clone it and then wanted to submit their change, it comes in as a pull request, and I'm able to review it because being the admin of this, I can see these sort of things. And then if I approve it, I can essentially move it into the main branch that others would have access to. All right, so that is GitHub. Now, GitHub's pretty neat, obviously free for open source projects, because not all projects are going to be open source. So you might want a different hosting solution. So this one here, Bitbucket, looks like a pretty good one. Let me just bring up their plan page. They also have a free plan and then paid plans for more users, which is pretty handy. I mean, starting with 5 users for free is a pretty good deal. And then you can go up, which looks like relatively reasonable amounts. Bitbucket only does Git because Atlassian likes Git. And they make also, which is available for free, this Git client called SourceTree. So what we can try here with SourceTree, and because it's made by the same people, it has tighter integrations. So you can again see here, it also does integrate to GitHub. So you can see that with my login, it's able to pull up the particular projects that are on GitHub. But you can see it also pulled up a project here that's on Bitbucket. And we can create a new one. We'll use Git. When I said it only used Git, I was meaning it only uses distributed systems. It does have Git's partner in crime, Mercurial, which I've never used. All right, so I created a new repository here on my Bitbucket account. And now I can clone it to my local drive here. And this is a new one, so it's going to be empty. And if we go back to Finder, we see that folder here, and we've got nothing in here, just a big empty thing. But this is where we can move our project. So I just copy the Eddie's Electronics project in text format right into our local repository. And then we can come back to this theoretically. So now we can see all the files that are here. They all have question marks. The common thing you see in the various clients, which means that they don't know what to do with them yet. And we just want to, I think I can click the add button on the toolbar. So we've now added the files that we put in the folder into essentially Git's tracking mechanism. So now they show up here, and they've got little pluses next to them now, which means they're ready to be added. And I expect looking at this, must be fun for all of you watching me driving this stuff. It's like a teenager taking his driver's license test or something. All right, so you can just hit a button here. And this also has a checkbox here that says push commits immediately. So as soon as I do this commit, I want to send it all up to the server. So I'm just going to check that box. And that apparently is various command line stuff it's doing behind the scenes. Interesting. So if we go back to Bitbucket, alrighty, I wanted to, here it is. So we can see now that the repository was created and the commit was pushed in. And you can view all this online and see everything. And I mean, the same overall process works with making changes. As you edit things, they show up as changed in the client you're using. So let's make sure this is the GitHub Bitbucket one. So we'll change this name and save. Go back to source tree. And you can see here that it found changes. Now, at least in Subversion, I can usually right-click on this UI state file, and there's something called ignore that I can click. Seems to be grayed out here. And I know there are, when you're configuring your Git stuff there, you can plug in extensions for various files to ignore and whatnot. So it's probably likely that I could configure the Git server so that these things are ignored and don't get flagged as changes. So we can see that here's the change. I can click on it and you can see it over here on the right. And you can see it found a couple changes. The main one we made here is the change to the title. It looks like it saving that changed the file format ever so slightly in other ways, which can happen sometimes as you switch between versions of Xojo or save something that was initially created in an older version of Xojo, and there might be newer properties or something behind the scenes. And then these sort of things, you just commit. Looking for a refresh button there. We'll use the one in the browser. So you can see the changes that show up here each time. The various commits. This all gets really neat when you do have multiple people on the teams. You can see exactly who's working on what and the changes they made, which is just incredibly handy. But still, if I were the only person working on this project, this also is handy because it does allow me to have a record of what I changed. It does serve as an online permanent repository or backup. It does allow you to give access to the code pretty easily to others, should you need to. And it's a way to prevent yourself from making mistakes, as you have every record of every change. And, obviously changing window titles isn't something that's likely to break your app, but other things, complex changes, could very well break an app. And being able to isolate those into specific commits so that should bugs arise that are problematic or showstoppers or whatnot, you're able to go back to an earlier version of the file before you made those changes. And helpful information from the viewers is that I couldn't ignore the UI state file because, and this makes perfect sense, I actually tracked it. Now, in the case of Subversion, I would undo the tracking and then ignore. I should have ignored it before I added it to the Git tracking. So let's see if I pick stop tracking on this. I should then have ignore enabled, and then I can ignore the exact file. In this particular project, this is the only UI state file that will show up. So I guess I'll just leave it at the default. Looks like I could probably do all of them with the extension, add it to a global. Maybe that would take effect for all projects. Don't know. Would have to spend a little bit more time with Bitbucket. But there, now it doesn't show up as a change any longer, which is handy because otherwise it would show up pretty much anytime you resized a window or did anything else. All right, that is Git in a nutshell. What little limited knowledge I have of it. I mean, frankly, I think it's pretty cool, and if I used it more often, I'd obviously be a lot more comfortable with it. If I were starting from scratch, never having used source control whatsoever, and I had to pick between the two, at this point, I think it probably makes most sense to start with Git. The tools that are available for it are pretty robust. They're free. There's a lot of free places to store the repositories, and I really like the ability to commit while you're offline. Obviously, with my Subversion background, anytime I use Git, I tend to try and make it work like Subversion, which probably isn't the smartest thing in the world, but that's the way it is. Let's go back to CloudForge here and yell at it a little bit. I'm really bummed that this example that I've done at least 3 times isn't working now. I don't see like there's any sort of message or update that it's been doing anything in the background. let's just see if we get any better luck. We'll do the Einstein thing or the opposite of the Einstein thing and keep repeating the same thing over and over and pretend we're not insane. Well, apparently there was just some sort of delay on the CloudForge end, and that worked. That is the same thing I did the first time, and this is recorded, so I can go back and check and prove it. So we have here the repository that's on the server, and it's broken up into the default setup that they use. It's obviously empty. There's nothing in it yet. So you want to work on it locally. We would just click on it, and we would click over here, and we would hit the checkout button. As I wait for data to appear, I don't know what the delay is on this. This is actually an SSD. You'd think it would be very speedy. All right, so I'm going to hit checkout. I now have it checked out. You can see there's a folder under here that is appearing. That's referring to the local working copy. If I go back to Finder, we'll be able to see it here as EE-test3, and you can see the different folders are here. And again, the same sort of thing we did with Git is we just copy Eddie's electronics into the trunk. And initiate a refresh. And you can see there's a little dot here. It indicates there's some new stuff in here. And it's indicating there's a new folder that was added, but it doesn't really know anything about it. So what should we do? And if we expand it, you could see all the actual files. So I can just click on this and I can hit add. And now everything does appear as added, including the same problematic UI state. And what I typically do, and there may be a better process, but I just revert the add on that, much like we did in Git. And now it gets, this by itself gets its own question mark, and I can specifically ignore it. And we could do the same thing on the website. So those are out of the way. So after it's added, and this is a general process, is you know, I'll create the repository, check it out, set up the initial structure of the project I want, and then I'll commit that. Well, we're waiting for that to upload. I'm looking here. Ed has asked a question if we have plans to fix Xojo to eliminate some of the artifacts of properties kind of changing, much like we saw on the Git change request, where a couple items appeared as changes that we didn't specifically go in and change. They were real more file format changes than anything else. And we have been working pretty much with each release to try and minimize and tweak those things to eliminate them as much as possible. But you'll see them often just from version to version as we're improving the file formats. A particular problem we had in older versions of Xojo between current versions is some of the items that were marked in files had quotes around them and probably shouldn't have. And we've been going through and kind of straightening now all those up to get them to be more consistent, primarily for version control systems like this, because it is, and we agree, incredibly irritating to essentially get changes showing things getting flagged as changed when you didn't specifically change the line. So that will get better, and it's been getting better the last couple of releases. All right, so now we can see that the project's been added. It now is showing up here in its entirety. And if we go back to CloudForge and, I don't know, refresh, we can see the initial commit is right here. And you can see I'm the top user on this account. Oh, none has still got me beat. That's the initial create of the repositories. I got to do more commits to pass this none guy. He's a go-getter. All right, so if we go back to Finder, we can open the project up and do our usual make a minor change. I think I got a bunch of these open. Hopefully we don't get confused. So again, a minor change there. When we go back to versions, and you can see we got the dot on that folder, which has a little indicator here, and it was changed. And typically you would work with the changed filter, so you'd only see the actual files that were changed or that have been changed. And then you can click on them just like you can with all the other clients. Obviously they all have their own little idiosyncrasies or different ways to tweak or work with things, but it all comes down to selecting the item and committing your change. And this has a few other views showing you the overall history of what changed, and then some command line stuff, and then the browse view where generally spend most of your time. As you can probably tell, I feel a little bit more comfortable using versions, and that's primarily because I've been using this since I think like 2008 or something. So it's easily the one I've spent the most time in. It did seem to get a few crashing bugs with the Mavericks release that I know they're working on. So I'm hoping those get resolved quickly. As my initial tests of Cornerstone, although it's very pretty, it's different enough that I won't want to change unless I had to. So that's how Subversion works. And as you can see, it's very, very similar, but it did require, in order to do the commit, that I actually, be connected. And otherwise, I can't do the commit. I could certainly do all my, code editing or whatnot, and the list of changes would continue to get longer and longer and longer. But then you're going to have to remember what is grouped with what if you want to have particular blocks of changes tagged together or committed together. So that can quickly get unwieldy if you're offline for a long period of time. All right, let me see here. All right, time is looking good. We've got time for a few questions here, so I'm going to head over to the questions window. All right, Justin is asking, any update on external items no longer being stored in XML versus the preferred text format? Yeah, that is current. It's not really a limitation, maybe more of an annoyance. Depends on your opinion, I suppose. With Xojo, you can use this concept of external items to share project items across different projects. Right now, external items can only be saved in one of two formats. You can save them in binary format, or you can save them in XML format. You can't save these external shareable items in the text format, which obviously is less than ideal when your rest of your project is in a text format and you want to put everything in a source control system and have everything be in the nice same file formats. So generally speaking, XML remains the way to go for this particular thing, because XML, at least being text-based, will allow you to do diffs or whatnot. We don't have an update on that. That's part of a bigger project to overhaul the file format in general, to improve it for things like this and other things. So at this point, there is no change regarding that behavior. You would still continue to use the XML format for your external items that you needed to share between projects. And I do have to say that personally, I never ever shared code between projects using external items. And that's mostly from a personal philosophy of I just didn't like to share things at a source code level, because I wouldn't want to make a change in one project, make a change that was needed for one project, and then have that change inadvertently break another project that was sharing the same source code block. So I guess I'm just a little risk averse in that manner. So I did never really use that particular pattern. But if you do, you're going to have to stick with XML for the time being. Which does bring up, we can do it here. One thing I didn't show is looking at diffs here. All the client tools, in one way or another, provide a way to show you the changes to a file and the differences between two different versions. So here I've selected the most recent version of the file and then its initial commit, and I'm hitting the compare button. And this starts my diff tool, which I have, which is Kaleidoscope. And that's kind of a companion to versions. I'm pretty sure Cornerstone has a diff tool built into it. And you can see here it has highlighted the change, and the most recent version it says this, but the earlier version it says that, which makes sense. And this sort of thing of comparing of changes is very handy when you are debugging and you've got new code that for the life of you isn't working, but you know it worked in a prior version. You can bring up both sets of code and kind of compare them and see what changed. And you can see here at the bottom, it's telling me there are other changes, and these are probably the false positives that Ed was asking about. Yes. It looks like the quotes went away on the most recent version, and I have no idea what that would be referring to. Space or something. All right. Let's see. Hans Peter, hopefully I'm getting the name right, is asking about problems. He ran into problems using end-of-line characters between Mac and Windows. And can Xojo be told what line ending it should use? No, Xojo can't be told what line ending it should use. I'm pretty sure you can tell the source control system which line endings to use or to convert to if necessary. So that might be an alternative option. I know that's possible with Subversion. I imagine it is with Git. Actually, I think one of my Google searches that I have that popped up on my email this morning actually had someone asking a question related to this just in general with Git. So that might be something to look up, as if there's a Git setting on that. And also, as you can tell, me not being the Git expert, this is a perfect thing that you can ask in our forum. There are a lot of people there that use Git that'll say, oh, well, you just need to do this, and then boom, you're done. Let's see, Christian is asking if it's possible to work as a team on one project. Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, we do that here at Xojo. We've got a team of engineers that work on Xojo itself. Um, you definitely, and that's one of the main reasons to use source control is so that a team working on a single project doesn't completely obliterate changes that another team member made. So yeah, absolutely, you want to do that. That works fine with Xojo. I've done it personally myself many times. Definitely a way to go. All right, let's see here. Wolfgang is asking about finding specific settings in source tree. Yeah, I don't know if I can actually remember to tell you. Let's see here. Oh, it's the same settings file. Yeah, I don't remember. When I brought everything up, there was an initial window that had, oh, here it is, this bookmarks. No, it's this hosted repository window. Yes, and I was able to add accounts right here. So just going to get to this hosted repository window. Which offhand, I can't tell you. I believe it came up right when I started source tree the first time. I'm just reading more comments here. Yeah, haven't lost the connection. Let's see here. And our resident, not our resident, but the Xojo community's resident Git expert, Justin Elliott, is just giving me all kinds of information here, just like he did at the conference, most of which I've long forgotten. So certainly feel free to ask in the forums. I'm sure he'll be lurking there and he'll be very eager to dive in. But he's pointing out that Git has excellent support for line endings by platform and for, yeah, that he actually gave a Git setting here. I'm going to cut and paste this. All right, from Justin, this line here apparently does something with line feeds on Git. All right, and also one other thing I do want to mention is branches and merging. I'm not going to go into much detail on branches and or merging anyway, but branches are cool. And I had mentioned I'll do this on the Subversion side because this is where I've actually done it before, and I might actually know what I'm talking about, maybe. In the case of Subversion, branches and tags are just copies of a particular folder structure. So if I wanted to tag this version of Eddie's Electronics, I would just drag it. I think here I'm holding down Option so that it does a copy. And I can give it a name. Type it correctly. And then this essentially becomes the tag. And then I could commit this into the repository. I'm not going to do that now because that seemed to take a few minutes when I did it the first time. And then now essentially I have a not two full copies. This Subversion, and I'm assuming Git is smart about this, where it won't duplicate things that are exactly the same. But I've got two virtual copies, effectively, of this project. So now that I've got this tagged here, and I could do the same thing by copying it to a branch. It's just more terminology in the case of Subversion. I can go back to the trunk, make all the changes I want. The stuff that's in the branch of the tag is not affected. So if I'm now working on Eddie's Electronics 2.0, and I'm halfway through that and I've made a bazillion changes, and then I get a critical bug report in the 1.0 version that I do have to go back and fix. Well, that would be practically impossible if I didn't have the code pre-branched or tagged in some way. so that I can go back to that code at that point in time, make the appropriate fix that's necessary, and then do a new build and make that available without impacting the 2.0 source structure. Like I said, branches and tags in the case of Subversion are just different folders. They pretty much work exactly the same. The other concept that you may find you have to do is to merge changes. Merging can happen if two developers happen to change the same thing. You could get what's called a conflict. So if I went into the Eddie's Electronics project and changed the window title, and then someone else on my team also changed the window title for some reason and changed it to a different title, and you both kind of did that at the same-ish time, such that your copy is has the original title, someone else has the original title, then you both check in different titles. Well, there's a conflict at that point, and you have to figure out what to do. Someone has to figure out what to do. And depending on the changes, it could be that you just have to merge them together because maybe you didn't change the exact same thing. Maybe I added a new method to the window and my coworker added another method to the window, but they're completely different methods. They don't overlap in any way. So those can be straightforwardly merged together. But if the changes affect the same thing, such as a change to the same method, it's possible that more manual effort is going to be needed. You may not want just a automated merge to try and say, all right, well, Paul wrote these 5 lines of source code, Bob wrote these 5. Let's just throw all 10 in the source code and hope it all works together happily. You generally don't want to do that. You want to look at the changes, compare between them, and see whose code might actually be the right code to commit into the repository. I don't have a lot of experience with auto merging, mostly because I've been using source control systems for a long time now, all the way back to the first one I used was, actually it was called, I don't even know if it's still around, it was MKS Source Integrity. This was probably back in the 90s. And it did things like lock files when you check stuff out, so other people wouldn't be able to access them. And in general, merging is kind of a tough problem. So I've just seen lots of cases where, a developer's just hit a button that said, okay, auto merge these changes, and then completely messed up the source code because the computer just, merged a bunch of unrelated code together into one file, and then you ended up with something that couldn't even compile anymore. So I always review these things when they come up by hand to see what the situation is. And, if you're working by yourself, the odds of those sort of things happening are less likely. The other situation where you may want to merge is you might want to merge a change from a branch into the trunk or vice versa. I don't believe the versions client has an automated way to do that. And how to do that is going to vary greatly between probably even the version of the source control system you're using. I think newer versions of Subversion are better about that than older ones. But I'm not too familiar with that specifics. So that's the sort of thing where you want to, use that link to the free book and read up on the chapter on merging if you feel that you're going to need to do that a lot. And frankly, it's not something that I've run into very often. You do see it, and it depends a lot on, your overall process, how your code is structured and stuff like that. All right, let's see. Mark here is asking, if you commit a bug, can it be reverted back out, or you just fix the bug and recommit? Again, that varies depending on the source system. If I find the right one here. So we can see here, this is the customer details window. It has a higher number because it's been changed more than the other things. You can see the different changes here, and this particular one has a revert to revision option, so you could actually revert the code to a specific revision, which pulls down that revision down from the server. And then, at least the way I've always done it, and I'm not going to say this is the right way or not, I probably should read the chapter in the book, is I will pull down the specific revision I want, and then I will recommit that back into the repo. And that works for me. It kind of gives you the right trail of what happened as opposed to completely obliterating it. I'm not entirely sure there is a way to completely obliterate it, but I'm often wrong about these things. When it comes to version control, there's a certain level of what you need to know, and then there's the crazy level of more advanced stuff that you use so infrequently that there's no way to remember it. So that was hopefully answers your question, Mark. All right, I'm a little over time, but it looks like I've caught up to the questions. So I hope this was useful for some of you. I apologize for the little glitch at the beginning there with CloudForge, but it's glad that it worked itself out. So again, source control good, not source control bad. Pick one. It doesn't matter to me what source control system you use, Git, Subversion, Mercurial, some weird one that I've never heard of. But do use one. Don't make up your own mechanism that you think might work better than a real source control system. It probably won't. And stick with it. Learn it well enough to do what you need, and then be happy that your code is now safe from yourself and from other accidents. So thanks everyone for attending this week. Next week, I think I'm covering SQLite, and we're going to be covering that from a strictly SQLite standpoint. I don't even know if we're going to look at Xojo at all. We're just going to try and talk about SQLite and some of its features and whatnot. So thanks everyone for attending. Have a great rest of your day.